Alright, so today we are testing the RX 7600 in Avatar Frontiers of Pandora. So today we're pairing this with a Ryzen 5 5600 CPU, non-X, and that again is paired with DDR4 3200 Mhz CL18 memory. So a very standard system, like mid-range entry-level, more entry-level, but it's a perfect pairing for this GPU, and we're not CPU bound no matter what settings we select. Anyway, so let's just go over the settings here. We're at 1080p. We'll be testing at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K. We don't have any upscaling enabled at the moment, no FSR frame generation, and we're on the high preset. I am unable to get this game to start on the Ultra preset, even at 1080p. I'm assuming it's running out of VRAM. Anyway, let's see how this goes. Just as you can see, we aren't really getting 60 frames per second here. That's to be expected. Remember, this game does have a ray tracing as well. It's got, from the description, it seems to have a software and hardware ray tracing. It definitely has hardware ray tracing, but not entirely sure about the software, whether it's all hardware or not. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. We're just here to test performance. And I mean, even at 1080p, this game looks absolutely great. I've actually progressed quite a bit in this game. Quite a bit further than this specific area. The game does open up and performance does seem to be slightly better in different areas, but I'm testing this because it is quite demanding, and for the first few hours you will be spending a lot of time in these specific woods. Right, so just for those of you, you're not really going to be able to compare these results with the 4070 results. That was done on a completely different bench system. This is my entry-level mid-range GPU bench system. I managed to get my capture card working, so we are back. All right, so we had a few stutters there. That's why our lows are sitting at 7 frames per second there for the 0.1% lows. But our average was okay at 50 frames per second. All right, so let's just go ahead and enable FSR here. I'll be doing the frame generation tests at the end because it does not work when you've got MSI Afterburner on. So I don't want to switch or disable MSI Afterburner each time I change a setting. So we'll just do that at the end. We'll stay on the high preset, and then we'll just enable, where is it? Scaling mode on fixed, and we'll use FSR Quality for this, right? All right. So one thing that you can definitely notice here is that the reflections on the water, it does become a lot more noisy once you actually start enabling FSR. That's unfortunately just the way it goes. You can see the leaves there. In movement, it's not as crisp as you'd really want it to be, but the game still looks plenty good. I'm not really a big fan of using upscaling at 1080p purely because we are now rendering internally at 720p. Although this game does have some good upscaling implementations, we can even drop this down to Ultra Performance and it seems to do quite okay. Just the frame time graph there is very, very stuttery. It's not what I've seen in my previous testing, and we're not running out of VRAM here because we are running at 6.5 gigabytes of VRAM used. Not entirely sure what the issue is with this GPU at the moment. I do have Radeon anti-lag enabled because I wanted to see if it fixes that issue. You can see there's a couple of big frame time spikes, and they occur periodically. Like it happens like this the whole time. So I thought that maybe anti-lag could fix it for us. It didn't, but not entirely sure what causes that. So now you can see it's gone, but they do reappear, and then they last for a minute or so. Anyway, so once again, our lows took a pretty big hit there. All right, so let's just drop this down to the medium preset. Let me get rid of that. So I'll be disabling upscaling here, so we'll just disable this, and we'll just drop this down to medium, and I'll just make sure that everything did apply because sometimes it doesn't, you see. So we'll just scaling mode off. All right, so 1080p on the medium preset. You'll see that there's still a few settings on high, so medium is just a name really. And let's just reset our numbers here if I can remember how. And you can see we're not getting 60 frames per second. So not really that big a change from high. did we actually change the settings? Let me just double check that. So we are definitely on medium. Didn't gain much from high. Maybe we did a few frames per second. Yeah. So let me just restart our numbers, and let's just see if those frame time stutters actually do recur again. I hope not. I've only been able to test this specific system for like an hour or two, so I haven't really troubleshooted any of the frame time graph issues. It does seem to be slightly better. Let's just see if we run underneath this branch, and that's where it happened previously. You can see the frame time graph thicken there. Not entirely sure what that's all about. Anyway, but we can actually use FSR frame generation as well. We are at around 60 frames per second, so we'll be testing it at native and then with FSR set to quality. It should be pretty good. From what I've tested so far, the input latency is really not noticeable with FSR frame generation in this game. Not sure what magic they pulled there, but it definitely feels quite okay. All right, so that was it for the medium preset. So let's just enable FSR quality quickly. All right, so just FSR quality, still on 1080p on the medium preset, and I think we should be getting around 90 frames per second here. And I thought wrong. Let me just reset our numbers. Sorry. All right. So 80 frames per second it is. And the frame time graph is still doing its weird thing with dipping. Our 0.1% lows are at 27 frames per second. It's better than previously. Previously was sitting at 7. So quite a big increase there. But still not the smoothest experience with this RX 7600. Which I do find strange because this game is sponsored by AMD and I'm running this on a full AMD system. Granted, it's a very budget-oriented AMD system, but it's definitely not terrible. I mean, the 5600 is a 6-core 12-thread CPU, and the RX 7600 is the latest 8GB GPU from AMD, so not entirely sure what's not performing as great as I thought it would. Anyway, that's it for our 1080p results. You can see that you definitely can get an above 60 frames per second experience if that's what you're aiming for. And let's move on to 1440p. All right, we're now at 1440p, and I just want to make sure that we disable scaling here. Just apply, and hopefully it applied. We're on the high preset, back on the high preset again, and 1440p, no upscaling, no frame generation, no nothing. And I'm surprised the game actually loaded up in, because as I said, at 1080p on the ultra preset, it didn't want to. Though we did get around 40 frames per second in the menu at 1080p ultra, it just refused to go into the game. And now we're getting 30 frames per second. So for those of you who like to play at 30 frames per second, you know who you are. This is acceptable. I mean, I personally wouldn't play like this 60 frames per second at least. But once again, the input latency feels pretty good. Like there's really no real input latency to speak of, even at 30 frames per second. It's I think they did some wonders here when it comes to input. I actually tested the DLSS 3 frame generation mod earlier, and even there, if I enable DLSS 3 frame generation on my 4070 system, the average PC latency is sitting at around 16 milliseconds, getting around 120 frames per second. So generally that sees around 45 millisecond average PC latency. So some wizardry is going on here. Anyway, so if 30 frames per second is what you're aiming for, then these are the settings you can use. You can now see that our lows are much closer to the average, which meant we had a much smoother game experience. The frame time graph was also a lot smoother, but that's probably just because we are so GPU bound. The CPU is literally doing not much, trying to prepare 30 frames per second. Yeah. Anyway, so let's just go ahead and enable some upscaling here. Let's see what we need to do to get 60 frames per second here. I'm going to start off with quality here and see what this gets us. All All right, so 55 frames per second, 54 frames per second. So let's just go ahead and go with, I almost click on the wrong one. Let's just go with the FSR Balanced. Yeah, at 1440p, it's still definitely good looking. I mean, it looks good enough. And now we're getting, I mean, almost 60 frames per second. I wouldn't mind this. All right, it's going to drop below 60 frames per second quite often, maybe even below 50 frames per second. So you might need to use FSR Performance here. Though I'd be a little bit wary of using FSR Performance at 1440p. Although I did say that FSR does look pretty okay in this game, even at very aggressive upscaling settings, DLSS as well. It's quite good. We'll drop this down to FSR Performance now, so you can actually see. Hopefully, it comes across quite well in despite the YouTube compression. But I mean, we're getting an average of 60 frames per second, and our lows are actually better than it was at 1080p. So pretty strange there. All right, so let's just go ahead and enable FSR Performance here. All right, let's see what happens. Well, I think we definitely should be able to hit 60 frames per second now, and 67 roundabout. But now I can see, once again, the reflections just start to worsen. All right, anyway, this game does have quite a few ray traced options, right? I'm not able to disable many of them. There's one that you can disable, but reflections you can only turn down to very low, the reflections that use ray tracing, for example. So unfortunately, you're stuck with that. And unfortunately, we did drop below 60 frames per second once. Right, so, but you can see I'm going to try and move by not moving the mouse too much. You can see that it looks okay. I mean, FSR Performance is a pretty low internal resolution, and it looks okay. I mean, I messed up our averages there, so don't mind the averages. Also, don't mind the screen tearing. The capture card actually records screen tearing. It does support VRR, but there's some issues with that, so I'm not using it. Anyway, so we had an average of 71 frames per second, so definitely playable using FSR Performance at 1440p. Right, so let's just go ahead and disable upscaling again, and then we'll move on to the medium preset. Right, so we're now on the medium preset and upscaling is disabled. Yeah, as I said, the frame generation testing will be done just after these settings. And what did we gain? Like 10%. We went from 33 frames per second to 36 frames per second by dropping it down to medium from high. So unfortunately, this RX 7600 definitely struggles due to, I'm assuming due to the ray traced effects, right? It's unfortunate, but like there's no way you'll be running this game at native 1440p with this GPU anyway, due to the ray tracing. So this is just to give you an idea. Hopefully we get closer to 60 or close to 60 when we use FSR Quality. I mean, probably not, as we saw earlier, but we'll test a lot of the settings. With the FSR Quality previously, we got around 55 frames per second. So if we do get a 10% increase there, we'll hit 60. That's my hope anyway. But now you can see that our lows, the 1% and 0.1% lows, are pretty close to the average. So 1440p, it might seem like 1080p is a little bit heavy on the CPU, because at 1440p we're not seeing these major frame time spikes, but I'll investigate a little bit later when I do have a little bit more time. All right, so let's do this and enable upscaling. Yeah, so let's just go with quality. Let's see if we can get 60 frames per second here. This game definitely still looks pretty good on the medium preset. I actually play on the medium preset with the 4070, just with the DLSS set to quality. I get around 90 frames per second, depending. I mean, it's actually a pretty good experience. And then with the DLSS mod, that boosts it up to around 125, 130 frames per second, and that plays very nicely on the 165 hertz monitor. So I mean, this is not a locked 60 frames per second, but it's pretty close. So if you lock it to 58, you might get a pretty consistent experience here, and it's not that far from 60 frames per second. So definitely playable. I mean, it does drop quite a little bit below 60 in certain areas, but that's just how it goes. So I think if we then just enable FSR on balanced, yeah, we should be okay. I think just reset our numbers. So this seems to be more or less what we had with FSR set to performance on the high preset. So if you do game at 1440p with this GPU, it's basically a 1080p GPU. Especially in this game, you can see the VRAM usage is pretty high. I think these settings would be pretty good. 1440p on the medium preset with the FSR set to balanced, getting around 60 frames per second, and that's your aim, then this should be acceptable. I wouldn't mind playing like this at all. Now we can still enable frame generation, and I think that'll get us closer to like 100 frames per second, 110 frames per second. So that'll be exciting to see. All right, anyway, that's it for our 1440p testing. Now let's move on to 4K. All right, we're back on the low preset here, and we disabled any upscaling here. And the reason why I'm playing on the low preset is because it's 4K, and we do get a VRAM error if we do set it to higher quality here. Not that this is a 4K GPU, I just want to give you an idea of what this GPU is capable of. And maybe the game froze. Okay, it did not. So let's just go ahead and do all this. So we're getting 22 frames per second. I must say, 4K, this game just looks so crisp. I mean, once the textures load in, that was quite funny. But you can just see that, like, the detail in this game, the branches, even on the low preset, like it really is phenomenal. That they really did a great job here with what the game looks like to bring the Avatar movies to the PC. Like it's really good looking. It's crisp. There's a lot of foliage. It's very dense, like very colorful. It's just great, and the game itself is pretty good as well. I'm enjoying it, but then again, I'm also a big enjoyer of the Far Cry games, except 6. It's the only one I haven't completed. I started it 3 times. I just couldn't get into it. The initial 1 to 2 hours, that was pretty fun, but it just became very boring very quickly. All right, so anyway, getting 22 frames per second, yeah, not ideal. And I do think we might be able to get 60 frames per second here with 4K. So let's just go ahead and hide that. So if there's not much we can do here. Sure, there's still some settings on medium, right? But we're not playing around with that. We'll just use upscaling. And I think, let's just use performance. I'm not sure if we'll get 60 here. And we're not getting 60, so let's not use performance then. Let me get rid of that. And let's do, it's under video, so let's do Ultra Performance. This is where I just quickly tested it earlier, and we got close to 60, so let's see if we can actually maintain it. Remember, Ultra Performance is now rendering internally at 720p, if I'm not mistaken, which is pretty much the same as 1080p quality. So expect a lot of artifacting. The upscaler has to fill in a lot of blanks to get the image up to 4K. But the performance is okay. So if you do have a 4K monitor, you can actually lock this to 60 frames per second, and it should be able to maintain 60. What I was saying is, if you do have a 4K monitor, then you can definitely play this game on that. Just use a 720p internal resolution. So FSR Ultra Performance. I did test the FSR frame generation at 4K. Like, that's literally the only thing that I did test on the system, and it boosted us quite a bit even at 4K, which was surprising. Generally, frame generation helps quite a lot when you are CPU bound, but it can also help when you're GPU bound, it's just not as much. All right, so that's the non-frame generation testing. Now let me just do some trickery to get frame generation and MSI Afterburner working, and then we'll do the frame generation test. All right, we're back at 1080p. We've got AMD FSR frame generation enabled here, and we're on the high preset. We don't have any upscaling, so it's just the native. And let's see what happens here. The input latency, really not that terrible, although it definitely is mitigated by using some form of upscaling. Just the FSR quality in this case should be fine. You can actually see our GPU usage is reporting we are now slightly CPU bound, which is it's quite weird because we do have a frame generation enabled, and I mean, it's not supposed to make us CPU bound. It's supposed to help us in CPU bound scenarios. Not entirely sure what's going on here. Although like FSR3 works kind of strange sometimes. I just couldn't get it to work on my RTX 4070 test system or the RTX 4080. It just like there was just a lot of screen jitter, and it just did not feel good at all. No matter what I tried. Some other people reported the same, and others said that it's fine for them. Hard One Box did a video on it as well. I don't know. I had many issues with FSR3 frame generation in this game. Over here, it seems to be pretty okay. Like I don't see the same frame pacing issues that I did on the AMD system, or not the AMD, on the Nvidia system. So maybe it does work slightly better on AMD systems, but it might just be due to anti-lag. Remember, Nvidia does not support anti-lag, so you don't have that additional input latency reduction. And I've also found that anti-lag sometimes does help in smoothing the frame times. How exactly, I'm not entirely sure, but I've seen that in Dead Island in my previous testing. Anyway, so let's just go ahead and enable some scaling here. So I'm just going to do scaling. We'll just use quality. You can do ultra quality. I do think that it's native still, and then it just uses FSR for the anti-aliasing. I'm not entirely sure, because there does seem to be some performance gains using that, but we'll just use the normal quality because that is what most people know. All right, so let's just do this, and now you can see we're getting a high refresh rate experience here. Depending on what you call a high refresh rate experience, I'd say around 120 frames per second counts as that for me. We won't be able to maintain 120 frames per second, obviously, but like it just feels so good. Like the motion fluidity is really great, and the game looks plenty good, and the input latency is not noticeable at all with these frame rates. Strangely enough, we are still, I mean, MSI Afterburner is reporting slight CPU bottleneck here. I don't think that's true. I just think the way that frame generation works, maybe there's some monitoring incompatibility, but this is actually pretty good. And with an RX 7600, this is probably where I'd play the game. 1080p FSR quality with frame generation enabled. All right, so now let's move on to 1440p. All right, but now at 1440p, we do have frame generation enabled. I do have FSR set to quality still, and we're still on the high preset, but now we do have a bit of a memory or VRAM warning there. It still works, but we might need to drop it down to the medium preset here. So let's just reset our numbers. And we're still getting a pretty decent experience here. So we did lose around 30 to 40 frames per second going from 1080p to 1440p. Now there's a little bit of a screen jitter. So, okay, so I might have spoken too soon. I'm not sure if this will come across in the recording, but it does feel like there's some frame pacing issues, like the screen. Well, the frame doesn't update properly with the screen. I don't know. This is exactly what I've seen with my other tests as well. It just does not seem to work properly. Maybe if we do try and increase the frame rate a bit, maybe if the frame rate is slightly higher, although AMD do recommend 55 frames per second 1080p or 70 frames per second at 1440p. We got around 65 frames per second before we enabled FSR. So I think it should work fine. It should actually work fine, but over here it definitely doesn't. There's a lot of screen judder issues, but over here it seems like even at 102 frames per second there is some, I don't know what to call it except for screen judder. Like it just doesn't feel like the frame is updating correctly. All right, so let's just drop this down to the medium preset. Let me just go, yeah. Let's see if we can get rid of that VRAM warning there. I mean, it didn't really change our estimated VRAM usage at all. So remember, we were getting around 90 frames per second, and now we're getting around 105. So you can still get an almost high refresh rate experience at 1440p with this GPU, especially if you use FSR. Sorry, I'm moving the mouse quite rapidly. I just want to see if that issue is still there. Sometimes it does feel slightly better now, but it does seem to come and go. Not entirely sure if it'll come across in the YouTube video because the capture card is set to capture at 60 frames per second. So we might have skipped frames. It might even look to you like the normal gameplay has some screen judder or skipped frames. It's probably because there will be some skipped frames. Anyway, talking a lot of nonsense here. A pretty decent experience here. 1440p medium, FSR only set to quality, and frame generation, we are about getting a decent experience here. Maybe if we enable VSync, it'll smooth out the frame time issues, but apparently it's supposed to be working with VRR and VSync on or off now. It doesn't matter which settings you use, it should be fine, but unfortunately I'm not finding it fine. All right, so now for the big one, let's move this over to 4K and let's see if frame generation actually works at 4K as well. All right, so remember previously we were sitting at on the low preset, yeah, and we also had FSR Ultra Performance. Right, so let's use FSR Ultra Performance here, and we were pretty much locked at 60. I mean, if you did implement a 60 frames per second lock, it probably would have kept that. And now we're getting around 80 frames per second, right? So I'm not sure if 80 frames per second is worth it. I mean, above 60 frames per second, you might now just enable some additional graphical options, although the VRAM in this case will become the limiting factor. Like it does seem, you see, textures aren't loading in. I think the game is going to break soon. There are definitely some textures not loading in, and now it just looks looks terrible. Even though it still says VRAM usage is sitting at 6.5 gig, that's not moving a lot. Like, all right. So in that case, just avoid 4K with the RX 7600. If that wasn't obvious, like it's not a 4K GPU at all, right? Don't use it for 4K. As I said earlier, like when we didn't have frame generation enabled, the textures looked fine. Frame generation does use additional VRAM, so I'm assuming we just went over our VRAM buffer there, and now the textures aren't loading in properly. Or do they? No, they don't look like this on low. So just don't play at 4K with the RX 7600. That's my tip of the day. All right, that's going to be it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.